You picked up your phone to check one message. Maybe it was a text from a friend, maybe a work email. You unlocked the screen with that specific intention, clear and focused. But then something happened. Your thumb moved almost automatically to another app. You told yourself you'd just scroll for a minute, just to see what's happening, just to catch up, but 45 minutes later, you're still there. Your eyes feel strained. Your chest feels tight. You've consumed an endless stream of climate disasters, political outrage, economic collapse predictions, and someone's rant about something that made you angry, but you can't quite remember why. You finally put the phone down, and the feeling that washes over you isn't relief. It's exhaustion mixed with a strange kind of dread. You knew you were doing it. The entire time, some part of you was aware. Yet you couldn't stop. If this sounds familiar, you're not experiencing a personal failure. You're experiencing something much larger, something that has hijacked one of the most fundamental systems in your brain. This behavior has a name now. It's called doomscrolling. And understanding why it happens, especially to your generation, requires us to look at the collision between ancient human psychology and modern digital architecture. This isn't about willpower. This is about design, evolution, and the specific psychological landscape that Gen Z inherited. The term doomscrolling entered popular vocabulary around 2020, though the behavior existed long before we had language for it. Journalist Karen Cahoe is often credited with popularizing the phrase on Twitter, capturing something millions were experiencing but couldn't quite articulate: the act of endlessly consuming negative news and content, despite or perhaps because of the psychological distress it causes. What's significant about naming this behavior is how it shifted the conversation from individual blame to collective recognition. Before we called it doomscrolling, people experienced it as a private weakness, a personal lack of discipline. The moment it received a name, it became a shared phenomenon. This is psychologically crucial. When a behavior pattern gets named and recognized, it moves from the realm of character flaw into the realm of explainable psychology. Doom scrolling is particularly associated with social media platforms and news feeds, spaces specifically designed for endless consumption. Unlike reading a newspaper with defined edges and endpoints, digital feeds are bottomless by design. You can't finish scrolling. There's always more, algorithmically curated to keep you engaged. For Gen Z, who came of age with smartphones already in hand, this design isn't novel or suspicious. It's simply how information works, which makes the trap even more invisible. You weren't taught to see the architecture. You grew up inside it. To understand why doom scrolling feels so compulsive, you need to understand negativity bias, a well-documented cognitive tendency that psychologist Roy Baumeister famously summarized as bad is stronger than good. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes perfect sense. Your ancestors, who paid more attention to threats, the rustling in the bushes, the signs of danger, were more likely to survive than those who focused on pleasant scenery. Research conducted by Baumeister and colleagues found that negative events have a more significant psychological impact than positive ones of equal intensity. A criticism stings longer than a compliment lingers. A loss hurts more than an equivalent gain satisfies. This isn't pessimism, it's biology. Your brain is wired to prioritize threat detection because for most of human history, missing a threat could mean death. In the modern digital context, this ancient alarm system malfunctions catastrophically. Social media platforms feed you an endless stream of content, and algorithms quickly learn that negative, shocking, rage-inducing content keeps you engaged longer. Your brain, still operating on ancient programming, interprets each alarming headline as a potential threat requiring attention. The problem is that these aren't immediate, actionable dangers. They're abstract, global, often unsolvable problems. Yet your nervous system doesn't distinguish between a predator in the bushes and a climate crisis headline. Both trigger the same vigilance response. Both demand your attention. And because the feed never ends, your brain never gets the signal that the threat assessment is complete. You remain in a state of continuous low-grade alarm. If negativity bias explains why certain content captures your attention, the dopamine loop explains why you can't stop scrolling. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter associated with reward, motivation, and pleasure. Crucially, it's not just released when you receive a reward, it's released in anticipation of a reward. This is the neurological foundation of craving. Social media platforms exploit what behavioral psychologists call a variable reward schedule, the same mechanism that makes slot machines so addictive. When you pull a slot machine lever, you don't know if you'll win. That uncertainty, that possibility, triggers dopamine release. Each pull is a gamble. Each scroll is the same. You don't know if the next post will be boring or shocking, irrelevant or engaging, but the possibility keeps you scrolling. Psychologist B.F. Skinner demonstrated decades ago that unpredictable rewards create stronger behavioral conditioning than predictable ones. Tech designers know this. Former employees of major social media companies have openly discussed how platforms are engineered for maximum engagement, using the same psychological principles casinos use: the infinite scroll, the pull-to-refresh gesture that mimics a slot lever. The random intervals of notifications, all of these create a behavioral loop that's extraordinarily difficult to break. You're not weak. You're up against some of the most sophisticated behavioral design in human history, built specifically to override your conscious intention. Your pocket contains a device engineered to hijack your attention, and it's winning. While doomscrolling affects people across age groups, Gen Z experiences it differently and perhaps more intensely. This is the generation that came of age during a sequence of cascading crises: the 2008 financial collapse's long shadow, increasingly visible climate change, school shootings as routine news, a global pandemic during formative years, political polarization reaching fever pitch, and economic futures that feel progressively more uncertain, unlike older generations, who encountered the internet as adults with already formed identities and coping mechanisms. Gen Z grew up digital. Smartphones became ubiquitous just as the oldest members of this generation were entering adolescence. This means your relationship with information is fundamentally different. For older generations, going online was an activity. For Gen Z, being online is a state of existence. There's no clear boundary between digital and physical life. Research from psychologists Twenge documents significant increases in anxiety and depression among Gen Z compared to previous generations at the same ages. While causation is complex and multifactorial, the correlation with smartphone adoption and social media use is striking. But here's the specific vulnerability. When you grow up in a state of perpetual crisis, consuming information feels like a form of control. If you're informed, you're prepared. If you're aware, you're not caught off guard. Doomscrolling in this context becomes an attempt at psychological self-protection. It's a paradoxical coping mechanism, using the source of anxiety to manage the anxiety itself. You scroll through disasters to feel less anxious about disasters, even though the scrolling increases your distress. This is the trap. Here's what makes Gen Z's relationship with doom. Scrolling particularly complex, you know you're doing it. This is the most therapy-literate, mental health-aware generation in history. Terms like anxiety, trauma, boundaries, and self-care are part of everyday vocabulary. You recognize doom scrolling as harmful. You've probably read articles about it, maybe even discussed it with friends, yet you continue doing it. This creates a secondary layer of distress, what researchers might call meta-anxiety, or anxiety about your anxiety. You're not just upset about the state of the world, you're also upset with yourself for compulsively consuming content about the state of the world. You're aware that you're harming yourself, which creates guilt, which increases anxiety, which makes you more likely to reach for the temporary numbing effect of more scrolling. It's a recursive loop. Psychologist Kristen Neff's research on self-compassion is relevant here. She found that self-criticism, even when accurate, often undermines behavior change rather than supporting it. When you berate yourself for doom scrolling, you don't strengthen your resolve, you increase the emotional discomfort you're trying to escape. The awareness-action gap isn't a sign of weakness or hypocrisy. It's a sign that awareness alone isn't sufficient to overcome behavioral patterns rooted in neurobiology and reinforced by sophisticated design. Knowing better doesn't automatically translate to doing better, especially when the behavior serves a psychological function, even a maladaptive one. Hit the subscribe button if you feel relatable and share your thoughts. Below, if we strip away the shame and look at doom scrolling through a clinical lens, what we're observing is a maladaptive emotion regulation strategy. In psychological terms, emotion regulation refers to the processes by which we influence which emotions we experience, when we experience them, and how we express them. Some strategies are adaptive, talking to a friend, exercising, engaging in creative activity. Others are maladaptive. They provide short-term relief, but long-term harm. Doomscrolling falls firmly in the second category. When you feel anxious about the future, uncertain about your place in the world, or overwhelmed by forces beyond your control, scrolling through information provides a false sense of agency. You're doing something. You're staying informed. You're bearing witness. These feel like meaningful actions. But psychologically, what's actually happening is avoidance, dressed as engagement. Research by psychologist Susan Nolen-Hoeksema on rumination. Repetitive, negative thinking shows that while people engage in rumination, believing it will help them solve problems or gain insight, it actually maintains and intensifies negative mood states. Doomscrolling functions similarly. You're not processing information in a way that leads to understanding or action. You're exposing yourself to threat cues in a continuous loop, keeping your nervous system activated without resolution. The content changes, but the underlying emotional state remains or worsens. Your brain interprets this flood of negative information as evidence that the world is dangerous, which justifies continued vigilance, which means more scrolling. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Doomscrolling isn't just an individual behavior, it's a collective one, shaped and amplified by social dynamics. Gen Z exists within highly connected peer networks, where being informed carries social currency. Not knowing about a major news event, a viral controversy, or an unfolding crisis can lead to social exclusion, or the perception that you're privileged enough not to care. This creates a psychological bind. The fear of missing out, commonly abbreviated as FOMO, takes on a specific character in this context. It's not just about missing a party or a social gathering, it's about missing information that everyone else seems to know. In conversations, online and offline, there's an implicit expectation of awareness. References to current events are woven into jokes, commentary, and social bonding. If you're not scrolling, you're not just disconnected from news, potentially disconnected from your peer group. Sociologist Sherry Turkle has written extensively about how technology changes social expectations and self-presentation. In an environment where everyone is constantly connected and updated, disconnection becomes conspicuous. Choosing not to engage with a news cycle can be interpreted as apathy or ignorance. So you scroll not just because your brain's alarm system compels you, and not just because the dopamine loop hooks you, but because your social world implicitly requires it. The algorithm plays a role here too. Platforms curate content based on engagement, which means the most emotionally provocative content rises to the top. The more people engage with crisis content, the more crisis content everyone sees. It's a collective feedback loop where individual behavior and algorithmic curation reinforce each other. Understanding the psychology behind doomscrolling is valuable, but you also need practical strategies that acknowledge the reality of your life. You can't abandon your phone. You need it for communication, work, navigation, and connection. The goal isn't digital abstinence, intentional design of your relationship with technology. One of the most effective approaches is what researchers call friction design, deliberately adding small obstacles that interrupt automatic behavior. This could mean logging out of social media apps after each use, so accessing them requires conscious effort. It could mean deleting apps from your phone and only accessing them through a web browser, which is less seamless and therefore less compulsive. Research on habit formation by psychologists Wendy Wood shows that small environmental changes can significantly alter behavior by disrupting automaticity. Another approach involves time boxing rather than elimination. Instead of telling yourself you'll never scroll, designate specific times for news consumption. 15 minutes in the morning, 15 in the evening. Outside those windows, news apps are off-limit. This creates boundaries without demanding perfection. Psychologically, it shifts the framework from deprivation to intent. If you're interested in more psychology deep dives on generational differences and behavioral science, subscribe for weekly insights. There's also evidence supporting grayscale mode, turning your phone display to black and white. Color is stimulating and emotionally engaging. Grayscale makes content less visually rewarding, which slightly reduces the dopamine hit of scrolling. It sounds minor, but small changes in reward perception can shift behavior over time. Finally, consider the 5-minute interrupt when you catch yourself doom scrolling. Don't force yourself to stop immediately. Instead, set a timer for 5 minutes. Allow yourself that time, but when it ends, honor the boundary. This reduces the sense of restriction that often triggers reactive scrolling. You're not denying yourself, you're creating structure. There's something deeper beneath. All the neurological explanations and behavioral strategies, something that doesn't get discussed enough. You've been raised in an environment that treats awareness as a moral obligation. To be uninformed is to be complicit. To look away is to be privileged. And there's truth in that, to a point. But it's also become a source of quiet, relentless pressure. You carry the weight of knowing. Every crisis, every injustice, every looming catastrophe. And because you're connected, because the information never stops, there's no natural endpoint to your responsibility to be aware. This is psychologically unsustainable. Human beings were not designed to hold the suffering of the entire world in their minds simultaneously and constantly. It's not that you shouldn't care. It's that caring without boundaries leads to a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't serve you or the causes you care about. Looking away, occasionally and intentionally, is not the same as not caring. Protecting your mental space is not the same as privilege or apathy. You are allowed to not know everything. You are allowed to disengage from the news cycle for hours or days. You are allowed to prioritize your psychological stability over being constantly updated. This isn't selfishness, it's sustainability. You cannot pour from an empty cup, as the saying goes, and doomscrolling is one of the fastest ways to drain whatever reserves you have. The work of psychologist Adam Grant on languishing that sense of stagnation and emptiness is relevant here. He notes that one pathway out of languishing is flow, the state of deep engagement in meaningful activity. Flow requires focus, and focus requires protecting your attention from constant disruption. Every time you reflexively check your phone, you fragment your attention and make flow less accessible. The real question isn't whether you'll stop doom scrolling forever. It's whether you can create enough space, enough quiet, enough psychological room to engage with your own life rather than constantly consuming information about everyone else's. That space is where you'll find not just relief, but the possibility of something more sustainable, not disconnected. Just breathe. Like the video, if you want me to cover more psychological topics,